Alright guys, welcome back. We have now covered the three parts of the biodiversity module, starting off with measuring biodiversity, then moving on to classification, and then finally evolution. And um, I might not have gone into all the details in the textbook. You do have to do a little bit of work, but I think I've covered the main concepts, the main topics, and hopefully provided some context for those topics and some examples to explain, you know, the main ideas. Okay, so hopefully you've followed everything so far, and now we'll be moving on to the last bit, which is maintaining biodiversity. Now, you guys owe me. You owe me big time, okay? Because I've actually sat there during my Easter holidays, and actually I didn't mind doing measuring biodiversity or classification, and I actually enjoyed doing the evolution bit. But I sat there on a holiday day and made a video on maintaining biodiversity, guys. That shows you my commitment, right? You can pay me back by getting excellent grades in your exams. Let's move on. So, maintaining biodiversity. Now, the whole concept of biodiversity, we revisit that now. In one way, you can think of it like evolution is the process that increases biodiversity because it's always coming up with new mutations, new variations, new adaptations, etc. Okay, so that evolution is the process whereby you increase biodiversity, but there are certain situations that arise that cause a reduction in biodiversity. Now, when they're natural processes, you can accept that. But the idea now is that humans are responsible for much of the loss of biodiversity that's happening. So it falls on us to kind of take steps to reduce the loss of biodiversity, okay, to stop species becoming endangered, to stop species becoming extinct. That's the whole concept here. So, it's linked to this idea of biodiversity from a point of view that if evolution is creating this biodiversity, um, organisms are adapted to survive then. Because of human activity, we shouldn't be losing that biodiversity. And of course, there's other reasons. Biodiversity can be beneficial to our human civilization and our economy, and and simply our survival. We rely on other species to exist ourselves. Okay, so we need to take steps to maintain the biodiversity, and that's what we'll be discussing next. All right, guys. So let's begin then. Um, I'm going to move quite quickly through this part of the topic. Um, Not necessarily because one might think it's a little bit less interesting. Not because of that, obviously, but simply because I think in this section, it simply does come down to you reading about the topics and essentially just going through it and making your notes and remembering the key points. Um, I would make the argument that certain things like natural selection, how that process works, requires a little bit more of kind of explanation from my point, for my part. But I would argue that maintaining biodiversity is one of the topics where it just comes down to you reading about the topic and making recording the key points. Now, if you do have any questions, if you do want me to explain any part of this in more detail, please leave me some comments so that I can address whatever part that I haven't gone into in as much detail as you need me to. Okay, so anyway, let's begin. maintaining biodiversity has got, in my view, it's got two main parts. First, it's understanding, well, let's call it three. First, it's about why we need to conserve species. What are the main benefits of maintaining the biodiversity? What's the reason? So that's that part right there. The next part is understanding what are the current major threats to biodiversity, and understanding what examples you could use to demonstrate that. So, for example, at the moment, one of the main threats to biodiversity is global climate change, and it's been proposed that humans are responsible for that in some way. So, yeah, once you identify what the danger is, it's important to realize then that the more you conserve species, the better chance they have of surviving these threats, these environmental changes. Remember, we talked about the idea that if you have enough variety in your population, whatever environmental challenge you give to that population, to that species, chances are that there'll be some varieties in there, that some variations in there that will allow that species to survive, at least a few members of that species to survive and pass on their advantageous characteristics. But if you don't have enough biodiversity, if you don't have enough variations in your species, you might put an environmental challenge to them, a change in temperature, a new disease, whatever, and they might not have the variety to cope with that. So that's the idea there. First, why we need to conserve species, and secondly, to understand that in the context of, maintaining biodiversity is so that if you put an environmental challenge to those organisms, they've got a better chance of surviving that challenge. And finally, conservation methods such as, conserving organisms in their natural environment versus outside of their natural environment, and how international cooperation works to ensure the survival of species worldwide. Okay, so that's the three aspects there. Why we need to conserve species, what possible challenges do they have to face, and finally, how do we go about conserving species? Okay, as I said, most of the details will be in the books. I didn't want this to be me simply reading out stuff from the book. Okay, so I'm gonna go over the main topics, the main concepts, the main ideas, but I will hope that you will then fill in the details yourself. Okay, let's continue. So, conservation of species then, the idea is you want to avoid extinction. When a species ceases to exist, when biodiversity gets so low within the species that there's reducing biodiversity, that's one aspect, but when you lose that last remaining member of the species, that's extinction. Okay, so you want to avoid that. Now, what's the context here? We're looking at this from the point of view that human activity is causing species to become endangered. We are causing a loss of biodiversity, and that loss of biodiversity is to such an extent that species are actually becoming extinct because of the things that we are doing. Okay, so let's have just a quick look at what humans do that can endanger species. First, we change the environment to suit us. Our numbers have, increased dramatically, which means that we are using more of Earth's resources. Now, in real terms, what that means is, for example, we might cut down, a wild forest area, such as what's shown here, and replace that with a huge field of wheat, because we need that wheat to provide us with food, nutrition. Okay, so this is just one kind of realistic example of what these, you know, slightly abstract phrases mean. So we're using more of Earth's resources. This can obviously affect other species, yeah? So lots of variety here, lots of different species, not just the trees, all the smaller plants, all the insects, all the birds that might be using these trees, this area as a habitat. Cut it down so we can replace that with one species of plant so that we can get food, okay? This is obviously a loss of biodiversity, and we might just cut down these trees thinking that, well, there's other members elsewhere, we don't have to really worry too much about that. But if this happens too much, we might reach a point where there's only few members of a species left, and if they go, that's extinction. Okay, dead. So that's essentially what we're talking about here. There are species that have gone extinct, while the human species has been on the planet, and it, in fact, have been implicated in having contributed to the extinction of these species. Now, it's not to say that humans were the kind of sole factor here, but certainly the evidence indicates that there were contributing factors there. Okay, so this is just the example that I talked about just now, that what we have here is a monoculture. Okay, that's the kind of term that comes up quite a lot. When you replace an area that has lots of different species, i.e. high species richness, and you replace that with one species of plant, and in fact, because of selective breeding, this might be a whole field of clones of a plant, because only that clone of plant has all the characteristics that we want. This might be just one species, one clone of that species. That's very low biodiversity, okay, because it's got, even within one species, it's got very little variation. Okay, so just remember the kind of implications of this, that not only we're getting rid of the trees, those trees are a habitat for many other forms, many other species as well. So remember that. Okay, so some examples of how human activities have reduced biodiversity. They include hunting for food, killing other organisms for protection. Now, maybe many thousands of years ago that we were talking about, maybe killing other wolves or other maybe organisms that were predators for us. But now, I guess that means things like killing insects. The example in the book states, killing mosquitoes so that they can't pass diseases on to us, that kind of thing. So it's still happening, just the context is a little bit different. Killing to remove competitors for food, so killing pests. All right, so if we have a large field of crops that we need for to provide food for our human society, and we are killing other pests, they're only going about their business of trying to survive, but we'll be killing them because we don't want them to ruin our crops, to reduce our yield of food production. So we are removing our competitors for food. Okay, because of chemical processes that we create, things like burning fossil fuels, chemical productions, things like that, we are polluting the environment. That could also be endangering other species of life. Destruction of habitat, just like the example here. Now, we've cut down this forest in this case to plant wheat, but we could just have easily have built a supermarket here or something. Okay, and we are also responsible for kind of unnatural movement of species, so introducing new species where they're not really native there, and that can create havoc in an ecosystem. Okay, So those are examples of human activities that can cause, that can actually reduce the biodiversity by endangering other species. So why is it? So, okay, we've discussed that humans do all these horrible things to other organisms, but why? Why, why do we need to worry about that? You know, you could make the point that we're just another species trying to survive, increasing our numbers. Are we doing anything different to what any other species on the planet is doing? Right? But we have the tools to think about what we are doing. So why do we need to conserve these other species? First, economic reasons. All right, nothing. Sometimes we don't really understand something until it affects the money in our pockets. So things like technological advances. Just zoom in a bit here. Things like Velcro, the design of wings on aircraft, they're all technological advances that were inspired by nature. Okay, so the hooks on this plant right here, the hooks on this plant inspired the way Velcro works, and Velcro, is really, really useful. Similarly, planes are quite useful. Now, the inspiration for their design came from birds. Now, you may argue, would this have developed if we didn't have this? That's the question I'll put to you. Okay. Also, things like, when a banker goes into the city and makes lots of money, one thing he might not be thinking about is the oxygen he's breathing in, or her might not be thinking about the oxygen that they're breathing in that came from plants. Okay, so for our society, for our life to be as it is, we do need these things like oxygen, like nitrates in the soil, so that the plants have enough nitrates so that they can photosynthesize properly, so that they can convert carbon dioxide into glucose, and then as a byproduct make oxygen. But that oxygen, we use that. Okay, so we can't take for granted things like this. They come from the natural world. For our life to carry on as it does, we do need the significant contribution of the natural world. Okay, things like pollination that flying insects do from one plant to another one. That increases plant biodiversity. That helps plants to survive changing climates and changing situations. Now, if this bee wasn't there, plants might not have enough biodiversity because there's no sexual reproduction happening. And if that wasn't happening, our plant population would, be threatened by any small environmental change. And what would we do without plants? Okay, so it's kind of broadly kind of summarized here as economic reasons, but our life couldn't continue as it was without either inspiration or direct contribution from other species of life. Ecological reasons, so it's kind of related to what I was just saying, but you know things like having oxygen, things like having bacteria that have very important roles in providing nutrients to plants so that we do have enough oxygen to breathe. Plants also provide, plants are the kind of basis of all our food chains. Yeah, it's going to be very difficult for us to have milk or beef without a plant. Okay, so it's very important that we realize that it's not just our survival. Our survival is dependent on the survival of other species as well. Ethical reasons. Now, ethical reasons are a bit broad. I would, ethical, religious reasons, I would always advise you give a specific reason. Don't just say ethical reasons. So some of these are, for example, that if organisms have spent millions of years, adapting very gradually over time to a particular environment, it's not really right that a human can just come in with their size 11s and crush them, kill them. They spent a long time making their place on the planet. Yeah, so they have a right to survive. um, I would say though that if one species is outcompeted by another species and that causes its extinction, that's okay. But um, if a species goes extinct because you know we wanted another Starbucks on the street, well, that's a bit out of order, isn't it? Finally, aesthetic reasons. Um, it has been shown that being surrounded by nature has a significant impact on our mental well-being. Now, I would remind you that in module 2, in that triangle of health, there were 3 aspects of health: physical, mental, and social. Okay, so if nature has an impact on our mental well-being, well, then that's something that you can't really ignore. You can't just put that to one side. Okay, I know from my own experience, I would rather be surrounded by nature than buildings. I don't know what your view is, but it does have an impact on our mental well-being. So if we just kind of take a step back from that, these are all the reasons why we should be conserving the species around us, why we should take steps to increase or maintain the biodiversity that surrounds us. Okay, it's not only because we should, that as you can see here, that's only one part of it. Yeah, there are actual benefits to us, to the human species, if we do maintain other species of life. Okay, right, so moving on from that, we then look at why we need to. Okay, so we've just looked at the kind of in general reasons why. Now we're going to look at why biodiversity is important. All right, maybe our the discussion that we just had was about why we should keep species alive, surviving, but this is more a discussion about why we should maintain adequate numbers of each species. It's not enough just to have 2 penguins and 2 panda bears. That technically that species is still there, not extinct. But why is it better to have 10? Why is it better to have 100? Why is it even better to have 1,000? Okay, that's the question here. Now, we talked earlier in our previous discussion about evolution that changes in the habitat of an organism is a type of selection pressure. That change will mean that most of the organisms might not be adapted to that change, and it might cause them to die. This was one of the key principles of Darwin's ideas of how natural selection was happening. And again, this is what we're looking at. If we're thinking about global climate change, in many ways, that's just another example of a selection pressure. Okay, global climate is changing. What are these species going to do in order to survive it? Well, they have to adapt. But adaptations happen because of variations. Variations occur because of mutations. And what we're saying is, if there's more members of a species, there's more chance that it's going to have those variations that might allow it to survive that next challenge. Okay, if we only have 5 individuals of a species and a new disease arrives, it's going to be very unlikely that those 5 individuals have the right variations to be, or mutation that give it the resistance to that disease. But if we had 1,000 individuals, it's more likely that one of them, or a few of them at least, have the right variation to survive that disease, that have a mutation that gives them disease resistance. So this is why it's important to have high biodiversity, because the more biodiversity you have, the more variation you have. The more variation you have, the more chance you have of surviving a selection pressure. And one of the main selection pressures that's around right now is the global changes in temperature, in climate. Okay, so reduction in biodiversity, just flip that coin, reduction in biodiversity means that there's a lower chance of species having the adapted individuals, i.e. their gene pool is smaller. That's just a way of saying we don't have enough different versions of a gene that might allow the right variation to be there. Okay, and therefore there's more chance that species will then become extinct. So how does global climate change actually affect species? Well, changes in climate, obviously, we've talked about xerophytic plants, how they have particular adaptations to survive in very dry conditions. Now, what if conditions changed? What if conditions became more humid? Would that plant then still have an advantage? Would it still be adapted? So changes in climate, increase in pollution. Because of changes in climate, you might have new diseases coming into an area, new pests, new organisms that prefer warm temperatures. They might start to move north or south. If this area of high temperatures gets bigger and bigger, that might give a bigger and bigger area to these pests to survive as well. So these are just examples of selection pressure caused by climate change. Now, straight from the book then, as I told you, this unit is a bit like that. You just have to go through it and look at the main points. So what are the effects of climate change? We could have higher carbon dioxide levels. We could have higher temperature. It might increase the rate of photosynthesis. Not all these points are negative, you will notice. We might have longer growing seasons for plants. So we might have more food being generated in farms. Greater evaporation of water, so we get more rain, which is also possibly another good thing. But at the same time, we could get changes in where it rains in certain times. So it might be increasing, rainfall might be increasing in one area, but it might be reducing in another area. We might have loss of land because sea levels are rising, therefore maybe reduced area for farming. We might have increased salt levels in the soil because of all this increased or the increased level of seawater, and that might affect the growth of crops in farms. But then you also have migration of plant pests and diseases. Just like we talked about, because of changing temperature, it might mean that certain diseases now can move into areas where it was previously too cold for them to survive. And these points are mainly in relation to plants, but in terms of animals and humans, we could also get migration of human diseases. For example, the mosquito that's the vector for the malaria parasite, Plasmodium, they prefer damp areas, warm areas, but as temperatures increase, they might be able to survive in areas where they previously could not have survived, and therefore, diseases such as malaria might not be then limited to certain parts of the world, but then might move to other ones. Okay. So therefore, we need to conserve these organisms, because if we don't maintain their numbers, they won't be able to survive these selection pressures. Okay, they might not be able to survive these selection pressures. Now, what I'm going to do is just reiterate that concept. Now, in my previous discussion on evolution, you might remember this diagram where I talked about three members of the same species showing variations within that species. And what I said was, because they have these variations, depending on whatever change happens in their environment, they've got variation that will allow that species to continue. So for example, if all these low-level plants died because a disease affected them, but it didn't affect the tall plants, these two individuals might die because obviously they can't reach the taller plants. But because there's this variation within their species, one of them with a tall neck, this one will be able to survive and breed with other ones and pass on the genes for long necks, so that the next generation of individuals will have a greater chance of survival. So I hope you can appreciate that having variation is important, but the similar concept would apply if in a different situation. So for example, if the temperature was to reduce in this area, this kind of individual with extra fur and extra hair, he or she will have a much better chance of survival than the other ones, and therefore the next generation will have more individuals with hair, and thus the species now has a greater chance of survival, simply because there were these variations. Now, what we're saying is, if because of human activity these populations of organisms becomes very low, they don't have that many variations then, okay? Because we've caused the on purpose or inadvertently, we've caused the death of so many organisms that there's only a few left. Maybe there's only a few left. So say this individual. Now say if this was the only individual here. Now, if the temperature went down, great. This individual will be able to deal with that because they would have that variation. But what if it was the low-level plants that died because of the temperature change or because of a new disease? This individual is not adapted. And because there's only a few of them left, we don't have that variety. We don't have long-necked individuals to choose from. Okay, so that's the idea here. If we don't conserve species, we don't have enough variations in those species, and when faced with a new selection pressure, when faced with new environmental changes, these species don't have the variety needed to be able to have any individuals adapted that could survive that change. Okay, so that's essentially the point here. So let's take a step back. Okay, so what we've discussed now is, benefits to us for conservation of species, but then, why it's important to maintain high biodiversity of the species. And now we're going to talk about how we do that. Okay, how do we conserve species? So three main things here. Two ways to conserve species, that's in situ and ex situ. But then there's also this idea of international cooperation. Okay, now here is where I've kind of summarized a lot, because there's only kind of a few basic concepts that I would really like to explain. The details, obviously, the specific details of examples, I don't want to be just regurgitating information from the book. Okay, that you can do yourself. All right, guys, so we'll next talk about conservation, how it's done. Conservation in situ is essentially when you have endangered species or a whole ecosystem might be threatened, you can decide to then conserve that species or those species in their natural normal environment. Okay, so you can do this by um, passing laws in a process called legislation that, whatever the situation might be, prevents hunting, logging in the case of, trees, or using land for development in order to try and conserve that area, that habitat, and all the species within it. The advantages of conservation in situ are obvious because it's the original natural environment of those organisms. That's the ideal thing to do. So it also provides permanent protection of biodiversity and whole ecosystems. Um, if you have an area that is kind of designated as a conservation area, you might then find that that area is more easy to maintain and manage. Um, it promotes sustainable use of the land. Okay, so for example, if you are monitoring, if you are managing a particular area, you can still use resources from that area as long as they don't do lasting damage to that area. It's not like humans are not strictly not allowed in these areas. Humans can enter and can do certain things as long as it doesn't, well, depending on which laws have been passed, as long as it doesn't cause any harm, long-term harm to the species that are there. It allows scientific research, such as being able to monitor and study organisms in their natural environment. It may be possible to eventually, and this would be a long-term aim, to restore the area so that it regains its original levels of biodiversity. That would be the aim. There are disadvantages in such a large area, so it's not like a small thing like a wildlife park or a zoo, for example. These can be very large areas, and it could be difficult to monitor all the organisms in that area, where they are, what they're doing, and so protected animals could escape. Just because you have passed laws doesn't mean that some people might not ignore those laws. As well as that, you might have tourists that might be unaware of the protections that have been put in place and might maybe interact with the organisms or cause them harm in some way inadvertently. Okay, so that's conservation in situ. There are more details to this, but I don't want to go through every single one. Moving on to, that's odd. Moving on then to conservation ex situ. Now, this is where you have to realize that there's two different parts to this. There's conservation ex situ as it relates to animals, and conservation ex situ as it relates to plants. There are different things to consider in each case, so please, do the studying in this regard. So the main idea of conservation ex situ is that species are taken out of their normal environment, and whatever conservation is to take place, it happens outside of that normal environment. Okay, now this might seem like a non-ideal situation, and in many ways it is, but in some cases you have to, because it might be that whatever is causing the animals to be endangered, it might be something that's happening in their habitat that you can't necessarily separate from the habitat very easily. So the best thing to do is to take the animals out of there. So disadvantages of ex situ conservation is that animals are not in their natural environment, and breeding rates are a bit lower because organisms might not have all the conditions exactly as they would in their natural environment, in which breeding would occur as normal. Limited space means, there's a limit to the number of individuals you can conserve in this way. And because of that, if you have low numbers, naturally you're going to start off then with a low genetic diversity, smaller gene pool, if you want to call it that, less variation, less biodiversity. So if you were to kind of start a breeding program to try and increase the numbers, if you're starting with low genetic diversity, that's not an ideal situation. Yeah, if you want to repopulate a species, ideally you want to do it with as much biodiversity, with as much variation as possible. Animals, once you can breed these animals in captivity ex situ, but it might be that they don't survive being put back into the wild, or in some cases, the wild individuals might not accept them into their herd or group, whatever it is. But there are advantages. So in ex situ situation, you can easily monitor. So we're talking about animals not in a giant, many acres ecological conservation, but we're talking about something like a wildlife park, more commonly known as a zoo, where area is smaller, it's easier to monitor each individual. You can, because you've got small numbers, you can make sure that each of them has got enough food, nutrition. You can have control over breeding. You can provide protection from predators and hunting, because obviously they're not in that environment where they're open to these things. And in this way, you can increase numbers so that you can attempt to repopulate in the wild. Okay, so at least it gives you a way to do that. A side note also is that you can also freeze the gametes, sperms and eggs of individuals while you have them in ex situ. And that also might then allow you to, via in vitro fertilization, increase numbers of individuals in that way. Okay? By carefully studying the reproductive biology of different organisms, you could then have a better chance of increasing numbers of organisms in the wild. Okay, so now let's move on to the plant conservation, which can also happen ex situ. Now, with the plants, it's a little bit easier because plants have a dormant stage, which we know as the seed. Now, that can be conserved for a very long time under the right conditions. You can collect these seeds from the wild, minimizing the disturbance to the ecosystem. So like you're not really taking a whole species out of a particular area. Remember, each species has a particular role to play in an ecosystem. So taking those organisms out of that environment will cause change to that ecosystem in ways that are difficult to predict. But taking seeds out of a particular habitat is a kind of very low impact thing to do. Yeah. Seeds don't take up much storage space. Plants can be bred asexually, so you don't have to rely on sexual reproduction, which can be a more complicated procedure. Numbers can be increased quickly with plants compared to animals, and once you have grown plants ex situ, you can easily replant these in the wild. Disadvantage is, well, however much you don't want to affect an ecosystem, you are going to affect it. So seeds you removed might have germinated in the wild, and so by removing them, you have caused a disturbance to that ecosystem. or just the presence of just the presence of the person being there to remove those seeds. That's a disturbance in itself. So it's not without impact. It reduces the true biodiversity. So the seeds that you've taken away would have germinated in that place. So by taking the seeds away, you've reduced the biodiversity of that habitat. Also, the few seeds that you have taken away might not reflect the biodiversity of the species. That there might be a slightly different variant of a species growing in a different area, but the seeds that you took from the one area that you went to won't reflect all the varieties that there are. Okay. Seeds may become non-viable over time. So just because you have seeds doesn't mean that they will last forever. Asexual breeding reduces biodiversity. Obviously, asexual reproduction means that you've essentially made a clone of the parent organism. And by essentially making clones, you are reducing biodiversity. You're reducing the different types of those different variations of those species. Okay, and research on captive bred plants may not reflect the wild population. So you may take some plants out of the wild or grow them from seeds, but just because you've done some research on those doesn't mean that the results that you get you would have got if you would have taken another member of the plant species from the wild. Okay. Seed banks. Now, seed banks are where these seeds are stored, and it might seem like a kind of odd branch of this topic, but I've seen questions come up on seed banks, so obviously it is a quite important idea to understand. Okay, so seed banks are essentially collections of seed samples. You can, the usefulness comes because you can preserve rare species in this way by preserving the seeds of those species, but also you can preserve important or useful varieties of species. So say if you're growing wheat, for example, now you might have a variety of wheat that can survive very high temperatures. You might not need it right now. The variety that you have, the variety that you're growing, might not need to survive warm temperatures, so you don't need to grow that. But it's useful to have that variety stored somewhere so that if there was an environmental change, if temperatures were to increase, you have seeds of plants that will be able to survive that warm temperature. Okay, that's important. So I've described an example of temperature, but it could be disease resistance, any particular characteristic that might be useful but is not necessarily needed right now. Seed banks allow repopulation of habitats, so you can use the seeds that you've stored in seed banks to maybe regenerate an area that's lost its plant life for whatever reason. Okay. You need to store these seeds in very controlled conditions. The lower the moisture levels are, the lower the moisture level is, and the lower the temperatures are, they seem to increase the lifespan of the seed. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind. But you do have to periodically test a few seed samples to make sure that they are still viable. Okay. In the case that they are not, you might need to then resource seeds from that species or certain varieties of plants. Okay, so that's seed banks. So that was conservation ex situ. We've now discussed how we conserve in situ and ex situ. And finally, we're just going to briefly talk about international cooperation. Now, there's quite a lot of detail in the books here, I don't know how much of it is really relevant, how much of it is things you absolutely need to know. But I guess for, looking at the examples of questions that come up, it is always useful to know different examples, because you might get a question where you have to make a suggestion about something, and it might just give you the edge if you have these examples in your mind. Okay, but what I'm going to do is just concentrate on the main differences between these different international organizations and what they do. Okay, so I'll differentiate them, and then you can fill in the details yourself by giving examples of what they do yourself. So let's begin. So CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Now, what essentially the aim of this organization is to regulate the trade. Okay, so the trade that relies on things derived from endangered species, the horn of a rhinoceros, the skin of a tiger, that kind of thing. It's this organization that tries to control the trade of these things, with the aim that if you regulate the trade, you can then regulate the demand. And if you reduce the demand of these things, because so if you have someone who is willing to kill an animal because he knows or she knows that they can sell it on, well, if that person then knows that they won't be able to sell it because there's this regulation in the trade, then it might mean that they are unwilling then to kill the animal because they know that they can't make any profit from that. So the aim is that by controlling the trade in that relies on endangered plants or animals, you can then give those plants or animals a better chance of survival because you're reducing the demand for their products. Okay? Moving on, the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is where a number of representatives from different countries come together and they agree ways that each country can maintain the biodiversity of the species that are present in that country. So they kind of make agreements about things that each country should be doing, things like having ex situ conservation of animals, plants, storage of gametes, exchange of gametes and seeds between different countries to try and increase the variations that they have in their independent populations. Okay, so it's where these different countries come together because they realize that there's an advantage to all countries by having biodiversity. There's an advantage of having lots of maintaining rainforests because it's possible that you might find useful plants in there. Maybe some plants that know how to survive or are adapted to survive in high temperatures. Some which might be able to survive in high humidity. Some might have compounds that are, medicinally useful. Okay, you can only find these things where you have lots of biodiversity. So there is an appreciation by these countries that high biodiversity is good for our society, and therefore we should be working to maintain it. And if by working with other countries we can aid that process, then that's a good thing. Finally, environmental impact assessments. This is something that is carried out on an international as well as a local scale. For example, well, let's just talk about the general concept first. The environmental impact assessment is an assessment that you do before a planned development takes place. So you assess what impact this new development's going to have on biodiversity, and depending on what that assessment shows or determines, that development is then either given the go-ahead because it's deemed not to have a significant impact on biodiversity, or it's kind of stopped in its tracks because it's deemed that its impact on biodiversity would be too great. Okay, so on an international level, we might say have a huge power plant that might be being planned in one country, but it might be that the pollution that's generated by this power plant would affect another country. So here you can see where the impact of a development in one country, it doesn't just affect that one country, it could be affecting other ones, and therefore you need this international level of assessment. Okay, that's the international level. On a local level, it could be something like a field. You have the green belt around London. Now, parts of it might be used for development if its effect on biodiversity are deemed not to be that great. But if a development such as a block of flats, now we're talking small scale here, maybe a new school, maybe a block of flats, something like that, maybe council flats, something like that, they first have to assess if by building this block of flats, what impact is it going to have on the biodiversity of the area which is going to be lost. If it's not that great, if species can easily be, find other habitats close by, if that migration is going to be easy, if there are availability of other habitats very similar to the one that's possibly going to be lost, then that's going to be something that's going to be okay. But if that species is endangered, if there's no other habitats for that species nearby, well, then that's going to have a huge impact on biodiversity, and such developments might not get the go-ahead. Okay? And I think that wraps things up there. We talked about how we carry out conservation. Remember that there's seed banks and there's conservation of plants in botanical gardens. That's conservation of plants, but then you also have zoos or wildlife parks as ex situ conservation of animals. So remember these different types. As well as that, you have the conservation in situ. What are its advantages and disadvantages? Bear that in mind. And then before that, we discussed, well, why do we need to conserve animals or plants? Why do we need to conserve species? Because there could be environmental changes around the corner, some of which we can see them happening right now. If we don't have enough variety within a species, they will not be able to adapt to the changing environmental conditions. As well as that, just for the survival of those species, we need species to be around, because not only for the ethical reason of the human effects on the environment, but because there are actual benefits to ecology, to our economy, for all these species to be there. Okay? And we first discussed how human activities would be affecting this huge biodiversity that has developed because of millions of years of evolution. Okay, so that was biodiversity, guys. I hope you will see how everything comes back to this key term of biodiversity. First, we talked about how to measure it. Then we talked about how to group it. Grouping these organisms based on their characteristics gave us an idea that they might not have just sprouted up out of the ground, but rather they would have developed by gradual change. All that evolution, that gradual change gave us lots of biodiversity, lots of different species. But then because of the human, the success of the human species, because of that, it's kind of harming the other species. And obviously there's an ethical reason why that's a bad thing, but we also have to appreciate that all these other species, they have a direct impact, influence on our life. Okay, if we don't conserve plants, we don't have oxygen. Basically, that comes down to that. All right, and there are numerous smaller examples of that. Okay, guys, so you might have questions. Please leave them in the comment section below for me, and I will try to address them. As well as that, if you have suggestions about things in F212 or even F211 that I haven't covered, please let me know so that I can make those videos. What I've tried to do is make videos that cover the main topics. If there's anything that you think needs a bit of explanation, I'm happy to do that, but you got to tell me first. All right, guys, good luck.